Thank you for listening to this part of my speech. And to start us off, I'll have this guiding question about the changes that we need to happen in order to realize the vision of the future expressed by African and African diasporic activists. We can no longer have the luxury of waiting for the future realized by the Africans and the Africans in diaspora and the activists. The day of waiting for the future was yesterday. We need to have the future, and we need to have it now. To wait means to continue experiencing racist microaggressions in Berlin. To wait means having to bear with the consciousness of skin complexion on either an institutionalized basis or on a physical basis every day that we interact. What needs to change? We need to see the agency, for it means success or failure in life. The current setup, as it is primed for failure of the other person, who is not one of us. If one needs to succeed, then one must move with speed to confront the system and confront it systematically. For example, the renaming of Anton Wilhelm Street in Berlin. We can use other strategies as well, of which I'll speak about one in a moment. So, how can we bring more awareness on the topic of colonialism? I do find learning to be an important tool out in my toolbox of liberation. It is the most systematized way of behavioral change across what we call nations. But then we also need to ask ourselves, do European systems reveal the depth of abuse that was inflicted on other nations? How does the colonial enslavement and exploitation get to the curriculum when it is not acknowledged? And at the very least, there are a lot of exceptionalist competitions within individual European nations. Is it not a little perplexing that a nation should imagine itself to have carried out a lesser evil on the colonies? It is little wonder then that the British technocrats, as an illustration, have coined the term Empire 2.0. This is a nod to history of the empire in Britain and a nod to the need for the empire within the promoters of imperialism. Europe loves memorializing the past. Actually, indeed, there is a museum of chocolate in Cologne, Germany, the Schokoladen Museum. I speak of museums because it's one of the two things that interest me. No doubt, there are many other ways of bringing awareness on colonialism. We need to dedicate museums of colonial pursuits, revealing the full extent of abuse that was committed on people of color, and curating the current conversations and this is quite important, expecting future transformations. In other words, we can bring the future to the present. If there is no official effort, for example, from European governments, then it is imperative on individual organizations to commit to archival means of negotiating the difficult colonial terrains. After all, we have a museum of chocolate. We can have one as urgent as a museum of German colonialism. And this would carefully archive the contribution of slaves and their descendants to the European economies, politics, and also in the creative economies. I am not saying that the Schokoladen Museum is a lesser museum. No. Never mind that it does not address comprehensively the economic tragedies that the Schokoladen industry of Belgium wreaks on West Africa. The age of information has brought us exciting new ways of engaging the past. If we cannot establish a physical space for a museum, then we can digitize the museum. We can have online awareness platforms of the destabilizations that colonialism brought and the variations in efforts that the victims of colonialism have had to seek their own agency. We can subsequently move to amplify the continuities of colonialism in the present circumstances, even after the end of imperial occupation by many European countries. We must stop the future from decaying. How can we dismantle the contemporary neocolonial relationship between Africa and Europe? What needs to change in order to decolonize ourselves and our environment? How do we dismantle the death roll that is the neocolonial relationship between Europe and Africa? In my view, this is comprised of two dimensions. There is what Africa must do, then there is also what Europe must do. For Africa, I have this little gem of wisdom from Frantz Fanon, who said that imperialism leaves behind germs which we must clinically detect and remove from our land and also from our minds as well. For Europe, there is a need to open up the present and the futures in which apology is possible. We must also open a future that is full of multiple narratives. No longer should we have a eurocentric narrative and approach to deal with the Afro-European connection. We must listen to the African demands without manipulation and the old threat of aid. We must listen to the African demands, and that involves that we must do away with models that have proved catastrophic, such as aid, in the past. And Africa will not accept it, nor will their descendants everywhere in Europe, in America, in China, all over the world. We should be bold to also speak of reparation where necessary and possible. This might be the elephant in the house, but certainly we must face it, and we must overcome the resistance that is evident. For example, in repatriation of the remains of Africans back to their homelands and the continued use of colonially looted artifacts for the enrichment of the European museum collections. If the European colonialist stepped in Africa through a borderless world, then the future must also be thought of as borderless, especially for the African. We want a world in which the Congolese will be able to travel to Berlin's island of museums without getting permission from Brussels. Importantly, a truly cosmopolitan world cannot exist if interaction and conversation take place only in one way. The exchange must be multidirectional and equal. The objects looted and taken from Africa must be returned. And we need to think of compensation for the collective historical and psychological trauma that colonialism wrought, as well as its legacies. We must accept that Eurocentrism transformed itself from a show of raw power in the last century to a show of legal power in this century. We must ask ourselves whose laws are used to bar the repatriation of museum artifacts back to Africa. Most certainly, they are not laws made in Africa. They are laws fronted by extensions of Europe, such as the United States of America and the United Nations. The legal framework that is used to keep the remains in Europe and artifacts in the museum is a continuity of a decaying future. I don't think we need a decayed future. what can local and regional agents in African countries and the diaspora contribute to the decolonization of contemporary structures? And this leads me to my conclusion. There is a very urgent need to rethink the future. There's an urgent need to rethink our futures. We need to have a conversation on what we want, who we want to be, and how we want to achieve this, and on what terms. Therefore, I envision one world with plural centers in which Africa is one of the many centers. History has time and again demonstrated that we do not necessarily have to have one world whose narrative is centered on one geopolitical narrative. Certainly, African history with Europe epitomizes the need to decouple Africa from a monocentered world. Thank you.